In December of 1900, on a remote island in the North Atlantic, a lighthouse light failed. It did not explode, and it did not collapse. It simply went dark, long enough for someone to notice. The island was called Eilean Mòr, part of the Flannan Isles. It lay off the western coast of Scotland, isolated and exposed to the open Atlantic. There were no permanent residents, no settlements, and no structures beyond a single installation, a lighthouse. The lighthouse had only been operational for a short time. Construction began in 1895 and was completed in 1899. Its purpose was clear and non-negotiable. It existed to prevent ships from colliding with the surrounding cliffs. The waters in that region were unpredictable and often violent. Storms formed quickly, and visibility could vanish without warning. The light was not a convenience. It was a system designed to ensure survival. It was expected to function at all times. 3 men were assigned to maintain that system. James Ducat served as the principal keeper. Thomas Marshall was the second assistant. Donald McArthur, a relief keeper, completed the rotation. All 3 men were experienced. They were trained to operate under isolation and strict procedural discipline. Their routines were defined in detail by the Northern Lighthouse Board. At no point was the lighthouse to be left unattended. 1 man always remained inside the tower, while the others carried out external duties if required. The system depended on consistency, and the men were part of that system. By all available records, everything functioned as expected. Until December 15. On that evening, a passing vessel made a routine observation. The ship was traveling through the Atlantic route toward Scotland, following a path that required visual confirmation of the lighthouse. The crew looked toward Eilean Mòr. The light was not visible. It was not dim, and it was not obscured by weather. It was absent. This detail mattered more than it might seem. The lighthouse was built with redundancy. The lamps were maintained daily, and fuel supplies were carefully monitored. The keepers were trained to respond immediately to any disruption. If the light was out, something had already gone wrong. The crew recorded the observation in their log. At the time, it did not trigger an immediate alarm. It was noted, documented, and then left to be addressed through standard procedures. Days passed. On the mainland, operations continued without interruption. Supply schedules remained intact, and administrative routines followed their normal course. There was no immediate escalation, but out at sea, the lighthouse remained dark. The delay is important, because no one approached the island immediately after the report. No vessel was dispatched on the 15th, nor on the 16th, nor in the days that followed. The next confirmed approach did not occur until December 26. 11 days had passed. The vessel sent to the island was the Hesperus, a lighthouse tender responsible for transport, maintenance, and personnel rotation. The journey itself was routine. There was no official indication of an emergency. However, as the ship approached Eilean Mòr, something was immediately wrong. There was no signal from the island, no movement near the landing area, no figures visible along the cliffs. No one was waiting. Under normal conditions, lighthouse keepers acknowledged approaching vessels. They signaled their presence and prepared for arrival. This time, there was no response. The captain attempted to make contact. First, the ship's horn sounded across the water. Then, a flare was launched to signal arrival. Both methods were standard. Both should have produced a visible or audible response. Neither did. At that point, the situation shifted from routine to investigation. Joseph Moore, a relief keeper assigned to the lighthouse, was sent ashore. He made the ascent alone. The path to the lighthouse was clear. There were no signs of damage, obstruction, or recent disturbance. Only wind and silence. When Moore reached the compound, the first detail he noticed was not dramatic. It was the door, closed. Not broken, not forced, and not damaged. Simply closed, as it should have been. He entered the lighthouse. What he found inside would later become one of the most documented and least explained maritime mysteries on record. The interior was intact. The lamps had been cleaned. The equipment was in order. Nothing appeared disturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of panic, no evidence of forced departure. And yet, there were no men, not in the living quarters, not in the tower, Not anywhere on the island. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers had disappeared, without leaving a confirmed trace. More importantly, they had disappeared without properly shutting down the system, because one detail remained unresolved. The light had been operational. At some point after the men were gone, the system continued to function, which raises a different question. Not what happened, but when it happened. If the light was still burning, then the disappearance did not occur all at once. Something changed over time, gradually, and whatever occurred on that island unfolded within a system designed to prevent failure. When Joseph Moore stepped inside the lighthouse on December 26, 1900, he was not entering an abandoned structure. He was entering a system that appeared to be functioning. The first impression was not chaos, and it was not damage. It was ordered. The interior of the lighthouse was quiet and intact. Nothing had been overturned, and nothing appeared broken. The space did not suggest panic, and it did not suggest struggle. Instead, it suggested interruption. Moore began with the living quarters. The room was arranged as expected. Furniture was in place, and equipment was stored correctly. There were no signs of forced entry, and no indication that anyone had attempted to leave in haste. Then he noticed something small, a chair. It had been slightly pulled away from the table. This detail, on its own, meant very little. However, in a controlled environment, such as a lighthouse, small deviations from routine were significant. Everything inside the structure followed a pattern. Meals were taken at specific times. Equipment was returned to precise locations. Movement within the space was predictable. A chair left out of place suggested that something had interrupted that pattern. On the table, there were indications that a meal had been recently prepared. There were utensils. There were remnants of use. But there were no men. The kitchen area provided another detail. One of the oilskin coats, which the keepers wore when going outside in harsh weather, was missing. The others remained inside. This detail would later become important, because lighthouse protocol required that no one leave the building without proper gear, especially during winter conditions in the North Atlantic. If a man had gone outside without his coat, it would have been a violation of procedure. If more than one man had gone outside, it would have been a more serious violation. Moore continued his inspection. He moved upward through the structure toward the tower. The lantern room, where the light itself was housed, appeared to be in working condition. The lamps had been cleaned. The mechanisms were intact. Fuel supplies were present. There was no visible damage to the system. This detail reinforced an important point. The lighthouse had not failed due to mechanical error. If the light had gone out, it had not been because the equipment stopped working. It had been because the system was not being actively maintained at that moment. Moore then returned to the lower levels. He checked storage areas. He checked sleeping quarters. He checked every accessible part of the structure. There was no one, no signs of injury, no evidence of conflict, no indication that anyone had attempted to hide or barricade themselves. The absence was complete. At this point, Moore exited the lighthouse and began surveying the surrounding area. The exterior conditions would provide the next set of details. The landing platform, used for supply deliveries, showed signs of disturbance. A large storage box had been displaced. Ropes, normally secured, appeared to have been loosened or moved. There were indications that something had impacted the area with force. The western side of the island showed evidence of recent storm activity. The cliffs were wet. Spray marks reached higher than expected. Equipment that had been secured in place appeared to have been affected. This suggested that severe weather had occurred in the days prior. However, there was a complication. Weather reports from nearby areas did not indicate a storm of unusual severity during that exact time frame. While the Atlantic was always unpredictable, there was no recorded event that fully explained the level of disturbance observed on the island. This created a discrepancy. The physical evidence suggested violent conditions. The recorded data did not fully support it. Moore returned to the lighthouse once more. This time, he focused on documentation. Inside the structure, the keepers maintained a logbook. Every event, no matter how minor, was recorded. Weather conditions, equipment status, daily routines, and any irregularities were written down. The logbook was a critical part of the system. Moore located it. What he found inside would become one of the most discussed elements of the case. The entries were consistent. At first, they described weather conditions, wind speeds, routine maintenance, nothing unusual. Then, the tone began to change. One entry described strong winds. Another mentioned conditions that were described as severe. There were references to unusual weather patterns, and then there was a line that stood out, a note indicating that one of the keepers had been unusually quiet. This detail was not technical. It was observational. It suggested that something had shifted, not just in the environment, but among the men themselves. Another entry referenced prayer. This was unusual. The keepers were trained professionals. While personal notes were not entirely uncommon, references to prayer during routine operations were rare. It suggested stress or concern. The final entry in the logbook was dated December 15. After that, there were no further records. The log ended. This aligned with the timeline of the light being observed as inactive. At this point, Mòr had established several facts. The lighthouse was intact. The equipment was functional. There were signs of disturbance outside. The logbook indicated increasing tension. And the men were gone. No bodies were found. No clear trail led away from the structure. The surrounding terrain offered no immediate explanation. The system had not collapsed. It had simply stopped. The logbook inside the lighthouse was not optional. It was a required part of the system. Every lighthouse under the authority of the Northern Lighthouse Board maintained written records. These records were structured, consistent, and procedural. They documented weather conditions, equipment status, and daily routines. The purpose was accountability. If something failed, the logbook explained why. When Joseph Mòr located the logbook inside the Flannan Isles lighthouse, it appeared, at first, to follow that structure. The entries were orderly. The handwriting was clear. The format was consistent with standard procedure. The early entries described routine conditions, wind direction, sea state, visibility, nothing unusual. Then, gradually, the tone began to shift. An entry dated December 12 described strong winds. This, in itself, was not uncommon. The Atlantic regularly produced harsh conditions, and the keepers were accustomed to documenting them without concern. But the wording suggested something more severe than routine weather. A later entry described the storm as unprecedented. This is where the record begins to diverge from expectation, because the Flannan Isles were exposed, but not unique in their weather patterns. Nearby stations did not report anything unusual during that same period. There was no confirmed regional storm of exceptional magnitude. Yet, inside the lighthouse, the conditions were being described as extreme. Another entry noted that Thomas Marshall had been unusually quiet. This detail stands apart from the others. It is not technical. It is not procedural. It is observational. The logbook was not intended to document personal behavior unless it affected operations. For such a note to appear, it suggests that the change in behavior was noticeable enough to record. Then, there is the reference to prayer. One of the entries indicated that the men had been praying. Again, this is not typical of lighthouse documentation. The keepers were trained professionals operating within a structured system. Personal reflections were not the purpose of the log. The inclusion of prayer suggests a shift in atmosphere. It suggests concern, possibly fear. The final entry is dated December 15. It states that the storm had ended, that the sea was calm, and that the men were preparing to resume normal operations. After that, there is nothing. No final note, no explanation, no indication of departure. The record stops. This creates a sequence that is difficult to reconcile. The entries describe escalating conditions, followed by a return to calm. The system, according to the final note, was stabilizing. There is no mention of emergency procedures, no indication that the men intended to leave the lighthouse, and yet, by the time Mòr arrived 11 days later, the structure was empty. This raises a critical question. Can the logbook be trusted? Because if the entries are accurate, then the disappearance occurred after conditions had improved. The men were no longer responding to an active threat. They were not reacting to an immediate storm. But if the entries are not accurate, then the logbook itself becomes part of the anomaly. There is also the matter of handwriting. Investigators later examined the entries to determine whether they had been written by different individuals. The conclusion was that the logbook appeared consistent with the handwriting of the keepers. There was no clear evidence of forgery or alteration. However, consistency does not confirm accuracy. The logbook tells us what was written. It does not confirm what actually occurred. There is another detail that complicates the record: the reference to Donald McArthur. McArthur was known among colleagues as an experienced keeper, but also as someone with a strong personality. He was described as disciplined, but also capable of emotional response. If the logbook is to be taken at face value, then at some point during the recorded period, all three men were affected by the conditions. Not just physically, but psychologically. The mention of prayer suggests a shared response, not individual, collective. This raises the possibility that whatever occurred on the island was not limited to external conditions. It may have influenced the men themselves. And if that is the case, then the logbook is not simply a record of events. It is a record of perception. Perception under pressure. The final entry, describing calm seas, introduces a contradiction. If conditions had stabilized, then standard procedure would have resumed. The light would have been maintained. The log would have continued. But it didn't. The system stopped. At this point, investigators were left with a document that suggested increasing tension, followed by resolution, followed by absence. There is no recorded moment of failure, no clear transition, only a gap. If the interior of the lighthouse suggested interruption, the exterior suggested force. After completing his inspection inside the structure, Joseph Moore moved toward the western landing area of Eilean Mòr. This was not a casual decision. The landing platform was one of the most important operational points on the island. It was where supplies were received, where equipment was secured, and where keepers interacted with the outside world. If something had gone wrong, this was one of the places it would leave evidence. The path leading down from the lighthouse was narrow and uneven. It followed the natural shape of the island, descending toward a series of rock formations that had been modified to allow limited access for boats. The conditions along this path were exposed. Wind moved freely across the surface. Waves struck the cliffs with significant force, especially during storms. When Moore reached the landing area, the first indication of disturbance was immediate. A large storage box, normally secured in place, had been displaced. This box was not light. It was designed to withstand harsh conditions and was typically anchored to prevent movement. For it to be shifted, a considerable amount of force would have been required. Nearby, ropes that had been used to secure equipment were no longer in their expected positions. Some appeared loosened. Others appeared to have been pulled free. There were also signs that equipment had been exposed to impact. The rock surface showed marks consistent with repeated force, as though waves had reached higher than usual. Taken together, these details suggested that the landing area had been affected by severe conditions. This led to an initial conclusion: a storm. At first glance, it was a reasonable explanation. The Atlantic was known for sudden and violent weather changes. Rogue waves, in particular, could strike with unexpected intensity, reaching heights that exceeded normal expectations. If such a wave had impacted the island, it could have displaced equipment. It could have damaged the landing area. It could have forced the keepers to respond. However, there was a complication. Weather reports from nearby locations did not confirm a storm of unusual severity during that specific period. Ships operating in the region did not report conditions that would explain the level of disturbance observed on Eilean Mòr. This created a contradiction. The physical evidence suggested extreme conditions. The recorded data did not fully support it. There is another detail that adds complexity to this situation: the layout of the landing area. The western side of the island was particularly exposed. It faced directly into the Atlantic. Any wave approaching from that direction would strike with maximum force. However, the keepers were aware of this. They were trained to avoid unnecessary exposure to the landing platform during dangerous conditions. Routine procedures limited activity in that area unless absolutely required, which raises a question: why would the keepers have been near the landing area at all? There were no scheduled deliveries recorded during that time. No indication that a vessel was expected. No procedural reason for all three men to be present near the edge of the island. And yet, the evidence suggests that activity had taken place there. One of the most discussed details is the number of men who may have been outside. As previously noted, one oilskin coat was missing from the lighthouse. The others remained inside. This detail has been interpreted in different ways. If only one man had gone outside, then standard procedure would have required at least one other keeper to remain inside the lighthouse. The system depended on continuous operation. But if more than one man had gone outside, then the lighthouse would have been left unattended. This would represent a direct violation of protocol. The absence of the men suggests that, at some point, all three may have been outside the structure. If that is the case, then something occurred that required their combined attention, something significant enough to override established procedure. Another detail observed at the landing area was the condition of the crane. The crane was used to lift supplies from boats onto the platform. It was designed to handle heavy loads and was secured to withstand environmental stress. There were indications that the crane had been subjected to unusual force. It appeared as though it had been strained or impacted beyond normal use. This reinforces the possibility that external forces played a role. However, there is still no direct evidence of what those forces were. No clear record of a storm. No confirmed wave height. No witness accounts from nearby vessels that align perfectly with the damage observed. The island itself does not provide a complete explanation. It provides fragments that suggest movement, force, and disruption, but not a clear sequence. If the keepers had been drawn to the landing area, then the reason must have been immediate. Possibly equipment failure, possibly a signal, possibly something that required urgent attention. But once there, something happened, something that prevented them from returning. There were no signs of a fall recorded in the immediate area, no visible remains, no clear path leading away from the platform. The ocean, however, does not preserve evidence. Anything carried into the water would not remain. This introduces a possibility that investigators have considered, that the keepers were taken by the sea, not individually, but collectively, a single event, a wave, or a series of waves, large enough to reach the landing area, strong enough to displace equipment, sudden enough to prevent escape. This explanation aligns with the physical evidence, but it does not fully align with the recorded conditions, and it does not explain why all three men would have been exposed at the same time. Once the initial inspection of Eilean Mòr was complete, the case moved beyond observation. It became an official investigation. The responsibility for that investigation fell to the Northern Lighthouse Board. This was the authority responsible for the construction, operation, and maintenance of lighthouses across Scotland. They operated within a structured system. Procedures were defined. Incidents were documented. Conclusions were expected. The disappearance of 3 lighthouse keepers was not a minor irregularity. It was a failure of the system itself. An inspector named Robert Muirhead was assigned to examine the case. He was familiar with lighthouse operations. He understood the procedures, the expectations, and the conditions under which the keepers worked. His task was to determine what had happened. Muirhead traveled to the island and reviewed the evidence firsthand. He examined the lighthouse interior. He inspected the landing area. He studied the logbook entries. From the beginning, the investigation followed a practical framework. There were no immediate assumptions of mystery. The focus was on cause. The first step was to establish whether the disappearance could be explained through known conditions. The evidence suggested that something had occurred at the western landing area. Displaced equipment, loosened ropes, signs of impact. These details pointed toward environmental forces. The Atlantic was capable of producing waves of significant height and force. In certain conditions, waves could strike unexpectedly, reaching levels above the normal range. These were not common events, but they were documented. Muirhead considered this possibility. The theory was straightforward. At some point, one of the keepers may have gone to the landing area to secure equipment. This would have been a reasonable action if conditions had begun to deteriorate. A second keeper may have followed. This would also align with procedure, as certain tasks required more than one person. The third keeper observing the situation, may have left the lighthouse to assist. At that moment, all 3 men would have been outside. If a large wave had struck the landing area during that time, it could have swept them from the rocks. The force of such a wave could displace equipment, disrupt the area, and carry individuals into the sea. This explanation accounted for several elements of the case. It explained the disturbance at the landing platform. It explained the absence of the men. It explained the lack of physical evidence. However, it did not resolve everything. There were inconsistencies. The first involved procedure. The lighthouse protocol was clear. The structure was never to be left unattended. At least one keeper was required to remain inside at all times. For all 3 men to be outside simultaneously, that protocol would have had to be broken. This was not impossible, but it was unlikely. The keepers were experienced. They understood the importance of maintaining the system. The light was not optional. It was a responsibility. The second inconsistency involved timing. The logbook indicated that conditions had improved by December 15. The final entry described calm seas and a return to normal operations. If the sea were calm, then there would have been no immediate reason to respond to a threat at the landing area. This creates a contradiction. Either the logbook did not reflect the actual conditions at the time, or the event occurred after the recorded period. The third inconsistency involved the missing oilskin coat. Only one coat was missing. The others remained inside. If all 3 men had gone outside, it would be expected that each would have taken protective clothing. For one man to be without a coat suggests urgency. For all 3 men to be outside with one improperly equipped suggests something unexpected. Despite these inconsistencies, Muirhead reached a conclusion. The official report stated that the most likely explanation was that the men had been swept away by a wave. It was a practical answer. It aligned with known environmental risks. It did not require additional assumptions. It provided closure, but it did not provide certainty. There were no witnesses. No bodies were recovered. No direct evidence confirmed the exact sequence of events. The conclusion was based on probability, and probability, in this case, left space for doubt. Over time, the official explanation became accepted. It was recorded. It was archived. It was presented as the resolution of the case. But the details that did not fit were not fully addressed. The logbook entries remained unexplained. The timing remained uncertain. The behavior of the keepers remained open to interpretation. The system had produced an answer, but not a complete one. The official explanation provided a conclusion, but it did not remove the inconsistencies. If the disappearance of the 3 keepers had been the result of a single wave, then every detail of the case should align with that event. The physical evidence, the logbook, and the procedures should point in the same direction. They don't. The first inconsistency is procedural. The Lighthouse Protocol was strict. It was not a suggestion. It was a requirement. At least one keeper was always to remain inside the lighthouse. This ensured that the light continued to function, regardless of external conditions. For all 3 men to be outside at the same time, that protocol would have to be broken. This is not impossible, but it is significant. The keepers were experienced. They understood the risks of leaving the structure unattended. They were trained to prioritize the operation of the light above all else. For them to abandon that responsibility, even briefly, suggests that something required immediate attention, something urgent enough to override established procedure. The second inconsistency involves timing. The logbook entries indicate that the weather had stabilized by December 15. The final note describes calm seas and a return to normal conditions. If this entry is accurate, then there was no active storm at the time of the disappearance. The official explanation depends on severe conditions, a wave of unusual force, an event capable of sweeping 3 men from the rocks. But if the sea were calm, then the likelihood of such an event would be reduced. This creates a contradiction between the recorded conditions and the proposed cause. The third inconsistency involves equipment. Only one oilskin coat was missing from the lighthouse. The others were found inside. This suggests that at least one of the keepers left the structure without proper protection. In an environment as harsh as the North Atlantic in winter, this would not have been standard behavior. If one man left without his coat, it suggests urgency. If all three men left, and only one coat was missing, it suggests that the situation developed quickly, too quickly for preparation. The fourth inconsistency involves the state of the lighthouse itself. The interior was orderly. There were no signs of panic, no indication of a rushed departure. The meal appeared to have been interrupted, but not abandoned in chaos. This suggests that whatever drew the men outside did not initially appear dangerous. It may have seemed routine, a task, an observation, something that required attention but not alarm. The fifth inconsistency involves the logbook. The entries describe increasing tension, strong winds, unusual conditions, references to behavior that falls outside standard reporting. Then, suddenly, calm. The final entry suggests that the situation had stabilized. If the logbook were accurate, then the threat had passed. If the threat had passed, then there would be no reason for all three men to leave the lighthouse at the same time. Unless something changed after the final entry, this introduces a gap. The logbook stops on December 15. The next confirmed observation occurs on December 26, 11 days. What happened during that period is not recorded. The system provides no documentation. This absence is not just a lack of information, it is a structural gap. The lighthouse was designed to produce continuous records. The logbook was meant to eliminate uncertainty. But in this case, the record ends before the event. The final inconsistency involves the absence itself. There were no bodies. No remains were recovered from the island or the surrounding waters. This, on its own, does not eliminate the possibility of a wave. The ocean is capable of removing evidence completely, but it does mean that the conclusion cannot be verified. The explanation relies on inference. Each of these inconsistencies, taken individually, can be addressed. The procedure can be broken. Records can be incomplete. Equipment can be left behind. But taken together, they create a pattern in which the official explanation fits most of the evidence, but not all of it. And in a system designed to eliminate uncertainty, partial alignment is not the same as resolution. The case remains open, not in an official sense, but in a structural one, because the explanation depends on assumptions that cannot be fully confirmed. When a case is explained but not resolved, something predictable happens. The explanation remains on record, but alternative interpretations begin to form around it. The disappearance of the three lighthouse keepers at Eilean Mòr is one of those cases. The official conclusion remains simple: a wave, an accident, a loss to the sea. But over time, that explanation has been examined, questioned, and, in some cases, replaced with other possibilities. Some of these theories remain grounded in known conditions. Others extend beyond them. The first and most widely accepted alternative is still connected to the sea. It suggests that the official explanation is incomplete, not incorrect. In this version, the keepers were not taken by a single wave. They were taken by a series of events. One man may have gone to the landing area to secure equipment during deteriorating conditions. A second followed to assist. The third, observing from the lighthouse, may have seen something that required immediate attention. At that point, all three men were outside. Then, a sequence of waves. Not a single impact, but multiple surges, each one increasing in force, each one reducing the opportunity to retreat. In this scenario, the keepers were not caught by surprise. They were responding to a situation that escalated beyond control. This interpretation accounts for the disturbed equipment. It explains the damage to the landing area. It reduces the need for a single, extraordinary event. But it still requires one condition: that all three men were outside at the same time. Which brings us back to procedure. Another theory focuses less on the sea and more on human behavior. It suggests that the disappearance may have involved conflict, not external, internal. Three men, isolated on a remote island, limited communication, harsh conditions, strict routine. Over time, such an environment can produce tension. The logbook entries, which reference unusual behavior and emotional response, have been used to support this idea. In this interpretation, something changed among the men, a disagreement, a breakdown in discipline, an event that disrupted the structure of their routine. If such a conflict occurred near the edge of the island, it could have led to an accident. A fall, a misstep, an attempt to intervene. One man falls, another attempt to help, the third follows, and the result is the same. 3 men lost to the sea. This theory does not require extreme weather. It relies on human factors, but it introduces a different set of questions. There were no signs of struggle inside the lighthouse, no damage, no evidence of conflict. If something occurred, it left no clear trace. Another interpretation focuses on the logbook itself. It suggests that the entries reflect more than environmental conditions. They reflect perception. The references to unusual weather, emotional behavior, and prayer have been interpreted by some as indicators of psychological strain. Isolation, combined with environmental pressure, can alter perception. In extreme cases, it can affect judgment. If the keepers believed they were facing a severe threat, even if that threat was not fully supported by external data, their actions may have been influenced by that belief. In this scenario, the decision to leave the lighthouse may not have been based on actual conditions. It may have been based on perceived conditions. This could explain why the procedure was abandoned. It could explain why the logbook reflects tension that is not fully supported by regional weather reports. But it does not explain the physical evidence at the landing area. It does not explain the displaced equipment. It does not explain the absence of all 3 men. There are also more speculative theories. Some suggest that the keepers encountered something unknown, not in a supernatural sense, but in a situational one, an unexpected event, a rare environmental phenomenon, a condition that was not fully understood at the time. These theories often rely on the idea that the island itself presents variables that are difficult to predict. But without direct evidence, they remain interpretations. What all of these theories share is a common starting point. The official explanation does not resolve every detail. Each theory attempts to account for the inconsistencies. Each one explains certain elements, while leaving others unanswered. The result is not a single alternative explanation. It is a collection of possibilities. Each one is incomplete. After the investigation concluded, the case of the Flannan Isles lighthouse did not disappear. It was recorded, archived, preserved within the system that had failed to explain it completely. The Northern Lighthouse Board documented the event in official reports. These reports followed a structured format. They outlined the timeline, the condition of the lighthouse, and the conclusions drawn from the available evidence. The disappearance of the 3 keepers was reduced to a sequence. A light was observed as inactive, a delay in response, an inspection revealing absence, a conclusion based on environmental conditions. The report did not speculate. It did not expand beyond what could be reasonably inferred. This is how systems preserve events. They simplify them. They remove uncertainty where possible. They create a version of the case that can be stored, referenced, and closed. But not all details fit into that structure. Outside of the official report, the case continued to exist in other forms. Newspaper articles, personal accounts, retellings. Each version introduced variations. Some emphasized the storm. Others focused on the logbook. Some added details that were not present in the original documentation. Over time, the case began to shift. It moved from a documented incident to a narrative. In this process, certain elements became more prominent. The isolation of the island, the absence of the men, the unexplained nature of the event. These elements were repeated, expanded, reinterpreted, and in some cases, altered. For example, the logbook entries have been quoted in different ways. Some versions describe extreme fear. Others introduce phrases that are not present in the original record. This creates a secondary layer of information, a layer that exists alongside the official documentation but does not always align with it. For viewers, readers, and investigators, this presents a challenge. Which version reflects the actual event? The official report provides structure. It limits interpretation. It focuses on what can be supported, but it also omits details that cannot be confirmed. The expanded narratives provide context. They explore possibilities. They attempt to fill the gaps, but they introduce uncertainty. Over time, these two layers begin to overlap. The documented case becomes difficult to separate from the interpretations built around it. This is not unique to the Flannan Isles. It is a pattern. When an event lacks a complete explanation, it invites expansion. The absence of a clear answer creates space. That space is filled with interpretation, and once those interpretations are repeated, they begin to feel like part of the original record. In the case of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse, this has led to a situation where the event is widely known, but not always consistently understood. Some details are stable: the date, the location, the disappearance of 3 keepers. Other details are less stable: the exact wording of the logbook, the severity of the weather, the behavior of the men. This variability affects how the case is remembered. It also affects how it is analyzed. Because when the record itself becomes uncertain, the conclusions drawn from it become less stable. The official explanation remains, but it exists within a broader context of competing narratives, each one attempting to resolve what the original system could not. More than a century has passed since the events at Eilean Mòr. The lighthouse still stands. The system that once depended on 3 men has long since changed. Automation replaced routine. Technology replaced presence. But the record of what happened in December 1900 remains. At first glance, the case appears contained. 3 keepers disappeared. An investigation was conducted. A conclusion was recorded. But when the details are examined together, the structure begins to shift. Some elements remain stable. The lighthouse was found intact. The equipment was functional. There were no signs of struggle inside the structure. The logbook entries exist. They describe changing conditions. They end on December 15. The landing area showed signs of disturbance. Equipment had been displaced. The environment had been affected by force, and the men were gone. These facts do not change, but the interpretation of those facts does. The official explanation provides a framework. It connects the physical evidence to a known environmental risk. It offers a sequence that can be understood within the limits of probability. Yet the inconsistencies remain: the procedural violation, the timing of the logbook, the missing equipment, the absence of direct evidence. Each of these elements introduces uncertainty. Individually, they can be explained. Together, they resist complete alignment. This is what allows the case to persist, not because it lacks an explanation, but because the explanation does not account for every detail. In systems built on documentation and procedure, gaps are not expected. The purpose of the system is to remove uncertainty. In this case, the system recorded the event. It documented the conditions. It produced a conclusion, but it did not eliminate the gap. There is no confirmed moment when the keepers left the lighthouse, no record of their final actions, no direct evidence of the event that removed them from the island. The timeline exists, but it is incomplete. December 15 marks the final entry in the logbook. December 26 marks the discovery. Between those dates, the system is silent. That silence is not just an absence of information. It is a boundary. Everything before it is documented. Everything after it is observed. What happened within it remains unrecorded. This is why the case continues to be referenced, not because it is the only disappearance of its kind, but because it exists within a system that was designed to prevent such uncertainty. The lighthouse represented control, routine, consistency. The disappearance represents the point at which that control failed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but completely. 3 men, operating within a defined structure, vanished without leaving a record of how or why. The system continued. The light was restored. The island remained. But the explanation remained incomplete. The lighthouse on Eilean Mòr was built to prevent uncertainty. It existed to mark position, to define location, and to ensure that ships navigating the Atlantic could rely on a constant signal. The light was not just illumination, it was confirmation. A confirmation that the system was functioning, that someone was present, that the structure the records, and the reality aligned. In December of 1900, that alignment failed. Not gradually, not visibly, but completely. 3 men, operating within one of the most controlled and procedural environments of their time, disappeared without leaving a final record. The system documented everything leading up to that point. It recorded the weather. It recorded the routines. It recorded observations, both technical and personal. And then, it stopped. The logbook ends. The lighthouse is found intact. The equipment remains functional. The system continues to exist, but the record does not. This creates a division. Everything before December 15 is structured. Everything after December 26 is observed. Between those dates, there is nothing. No entry, no correction, no explanation. In most cases, that gap would be filled by evidence, by witness accounts, by recovered remains. In this case, it is not. The official explanation provides a solution. It connects the physical evidence to a known risk. It closes the case within the boundaries of probability. But probability is not the same as certainty. The inconsistencies remain. The procedural violations, the timing, the missing details, each one small on its own, each one manageable. Together, they form a pattern in which the system functions correctly, but the outcome does not fully align with it. This is what gives the case its persistence, not the disappearance itself, but the gap it created. Because the purpose of a system like this is not just to operate, it is to record, to ensure that nothing occurs without documentation. And yet, in this instance, the most critical moment was never recorded. The lighthouse remained. The island remained. The records remained. But the final sequence of events exists only as inference. Over time, explanations have been proposed. Some are grounded in environmental conditions. Some are based on human behavior. Others are shaped by interpretation. Each one attempts to resolve the gap. None of them remove it. And that is where this case remains. Not unresolved in the sense that no explanation exists, but unresolved in the sense that no explanation accounts for everything. The light was restored. The system continued. But the absence remained part of the record. More than a century later, the lighthouse still stands on Eilean Mòr, no longer dependent on keepers, no longer requiring constant human presence. The system adapted. It removed the variable. But the record of what happened in December 1900 did not change. 3 men were there, then they weren't, and the system that was designed to explain that transition never did. Before you leave, I want you to do one more thing. Tell me where you're watching from, and the exact time on your clock right now, because cases like this don't exist in isolation. Patterns only begin to appear when accounts are placed side by side. And if you've ever come across a record, a place, or a story that didn't fully make sense, leave it in the comments. Some of these cases begin exactly that way. And if you want to keep uncovering stories like this, documented, structured, and often incomplete, subscribe to the Lurking Archive. Because there are still records that don't align. There are still cases that were closed without being fully explained. And sometimes, the only way to understand them is to keep looking at what was left behind.